Good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you to everyone for joining us for the second of two webinars with Rabbi Professor Reuven Kimelman, presenting on the rhetoric of Jewish liturgy. This evening, we will learn about the meaning of Kaddish in light of its origin and function in Shaharit. My name is Noah Gradovsky. I am a vice president of the Union for Traditional Judaism. Before we begin, a few remarks and notes. Thank you to our sponsors of this program. They're also listed now in the chat. Our partners, Benita Nathan Sussman in memory of Jack and Evelyn Nathan, Juan Mesa Fredel, supporters Juan Mesa Fredel and Rabbi Gerald Sussman in memory of Dr. Edward Gershfield. Our friends, Rabbi Noah Gradovsky in honor of Rabbi Professor Reuven Kimelman, Leslie Monchar in honor of Yehudi and Brenda Feldman, Mitch Morrison in celebration of the leadership of the UTJ for continuing to offer inspiring Torah thoughts in its series of webinars, Rabbi Oren Steinitz, Dr. Claire Wolford, and Rabbi Moshe Weisblum. We'd also like to thank everyone who made a donation along with registering for the program. For those of you who are new to UTJ, let me add a few words of introduction to our organization. The Union for Traditional Judaism is a group of rabbis, scholars, and lay people who advocate for a passionate, open-minded approach to Torah study and observance of Jewish law rooted in classical religious sources and informed by modern scholarship. Our philosophy is distinguished by the symbiotic relationship between faith in the God-given Torah and intellectual integrity, and our emphasis on the liquid framework of halakha as our unifying guide. Finally, let me introduce our speaker, Rabbi Professor Reuven Kimelman. Rabbi Kimelman is a professor of classical Jewish Judaica at Brandeis University and rabbi of Beth Abraham Sephardic Congregation of New England. He specializes in the history of classical Judaism with a focus on the history of poetics and Jewish liturgy. His forthcoming study of that is titled The Rhetoric of Jewish Prayer, a historical and literary commentary on the daily prayer book. We hope to provide everyone with the opportunity to purchase this book at a pre-publication price. Stay tuned to your email for details. Rabbi Kimelman's other book is The Mystical Meaning of Lecha Dodi and Kabbalat Shabbat. Professor Kimelman's other writings focus on the interaction between Judaism and Christianity, on the ethics of war, and on his mentor, Abraham Joshua Heschel. With that introduction, and again with thanks to Rabbi Professor Kimelman for joining us today, we turn over to Rabbi Kimelman, and again, welcome questions and comments in the chat.
Thank you very much, Noah. I'm very happy to see so many returnees because the methodology of this presentation is identical with the methodology of we did with Yishtabach. Our claim last session on Yishtabach is that Yishtabach has to be understood as a bridge prayer from the end of Psukei de Zimra to Birchot Shema, Birchot Shema. And in doing so, it turns backwards to Psukei de Zimra and borrows language and anticipates material coming up in Kriyat Shema Uvirchateha, combines the two in Yishtabach, which is a bridge prayer. Our thesis today is that the Kaddish itself is a bridge prayer between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu. Apparently, about the 10th or 11th century, maybe even earlier, there was a practice where a person had a right to interrupt the service before it began officially if he had a judicial complaint or an issue of poverty, especially if it was expressed by more than one person. After Psukei de Zimra, the service would stop before the official beginning at Baruch Hu, and the person would lodge his complaint. When the issue was resolved, they had to get back to the service. The prayer that was constructed to get back to the service is called Kaddish. So the original function of Kaddish was as a bridge prayer between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu. That is why it is so different than other prayers. it was able to be inserted because it was not recognized as an official part of the liturgy. There are three indications that are not an official part of the liturgy. Number one, it's not all in Hebrew. It's partially in Aramaic. Two, it does not address God by using any of divine names, as Tefillah normally does, nor does it begin the service with Baruch. So the absence of Baruch, the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the fact that it's in Aramaic convinced the Rokeach, who writes about the middle of the 1200s, that this is a prayer bikarov, he says, of recency, and to underscore that it's recency and not part of the official liturgy, it lacks an address to God, in the lack of Baruch, and is Aramaic. So we're going to look at the prayer itself. I'm going to share the screen now with you. In the first part, we're going to focus upon the Kaddish itself, and then focus upon its connection with Yishtabach. Okay, so we have outlined the Kaddish in 12 different lines. What immediately becomes obvious that this is a combined prayer because of the repetition of the phrase Imru Amen, Imru Amen, Imru Amen. 4, and then again 8, again line 10, and line 12. Why would you have Imru Amen 4 times? 1 would be enough. Secondly, when we finish a bracha, we don't say Imru Amen. You automatically say Amen. Bari Priyagafen, Amen. People hear it, respond. Here, since it was not a known prayer, you have to tell people Imru Amen. The phrase Imru Amen also indicates it's a composite prayer. Otherwise, Imru Amen, 1 would be enough. 2 would clearly do the job. Why would you possibly have 4? So what we're doing is first is divide the text into its 4 parts. We have an opener, we have a communal response, we have a closer, and then we have a special ceremony of taking leave of it, which is at the very bottom. Now, the structure consists of 4 parts. The centerpiece, I mentioned to you, and the response. Now, where does this come from? Where does response come from? And how is the prayer composed? So then looking down, follow closely, it says the structure of the Kaddish consists of 4 parts. The centerpiece of 7 words is the communal response. It's preceded and succeeded by units of praise of God, each of some 20 words. Others specify they has to add up to 28 words or 26 words of the gematria of Yud Kei Vav Kei. The concluding part 4 has 2 overlapping lines. Now, the glue of the Kaddish is the repetitive units, which seem to be almost on every line. Line 1 and 6 mention the sanctity of the divine name. Line 1 seeks it, V'yid Kadash, Shmei Rabbah. Line 6 designates it, Shmei Dekucha. Lines 1, 5, and 6 contain the word Shmei. So we have a lot of repetition. 1, 5, and 6. Lines 1 and line 7 have the word Ba'alma. Lines 4 and lines 8 in the respective elements with V'imru Amen. We have quite a few synonymous expressions which tell you about its construction. One is Yid Gadel, Yid Kadesh, or Yid Gadal, Yid Kadash. We'll hope to talk about that a little bit later. Then we have Yatzmach Por Kanei V'karei Mishichei, 2 messianic expressions, almost synonymous. Then we have the phrase Bagala Bizman Kariv, which is again synonymous. Bagala means quickly, Bizman Kariv means imminently. And then we have B'chayechon of Yom Echon, again, 2 synonymous expressions. The doubling of synonyms continues in the Kaddish Tidkabel Shalem. There we see, and go down. We say low tone, their prayers and their requests. So even the additional element, the focus is upon 2 synonyms which go together. Finally, in line 6, look at the way it's constructed. We have exactly 6 words in the Yitpa'el form. Yitbarach, Yishtabach, Yipa'ar, Yitromam, V'yitnaseh, Yitadar, V'yitalev, V'yitalel. Interesting enough, do not repeat the words in the opening line, Yitgadal, V'yitkadash. So apparently it's an independent unit. If it were to take off of the first one, we would expect at least Yitgadal or Yitkadash to become part of it. Now, what's the last part? Line 7 has 4 liturgical expressions. They are Leila min kol birchata, shirata, tushbechata, v'nechemata. So the question is, are these 4 words synonymous, or do they refer to something specific? And then we begin with saying, V'yimru amen. Now look at the last 2 lines. The last 2 lines, 9 to 12, look alike, but are really quite different. Since they have similar expressions, it's easy to believe that line 11 is rendering line 9, even though they say things quite differently. When you have the word shlama, shamaya, aleinu, Ya'kol Yisrael, when you say it, you almost think that you're saying one line in Aramaic and one line in Hebrew, but you're not. But they get away with it by creating the illusion that the 2 lines are synonymous, as if one was in Aramaic, one was in Hebrew. Okay, so line 9 to 12 creates the impression of bilingual synonymy, but they're not. Now, where does all this come from? So now we're going to look at the origins of it. The thesis is that the Kaddish is the bridge between the Baruch Hu and the Yishtabach. So let's look at the easy part first. The response of the Kaddish is Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mavorach Le'alam Omei Amaya. They have the 3 parts which appear in almost all classical liturgy. That is a reference to God, that God is Baruch, and that it lasts forever. This changed in the Amoraic period, which required the introduction of God Malchut, and the requirement that Shem Hashem be used. Others required Atah. So therefore, our opening bracha goes Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Olam. But that's later on. In classical Second Temple liturgy and in Tannaitic liturgy, there are 3 requirements. Those requirements are Baruch, Shem, Le'olam Va'ed. So in the Yehei Shmei Rabbah, Yehei Shmei, that's Shem, Mevorach, Baruch, Le'olam Omei Amaya is Le'olam Va'ed. So we have a temporal, lasting forever, and God's name is blessed. So the argument is Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevorach, Le'olam Omei Amaya is inserted into the Kaddish, because the Kaddish is the bridge between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu. Therefore, the response comes to imitate or to emulate or to anticipate the Baruch Hu. Now, the response Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevorach Le'olam Omei Amaya is found oftentimes in the Talmud and the Midrash. There, it's almost always a response to something, but it's not a response to the Kaddish. The Kaddish does not exist in classical rabbinic literature. It first appears in Masechet Sofrim, except we don't know exactly when Masechet Sofrim was written. It could be 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, even as late as 10th century. Why? Because Masechet Sofrim incorporates a lot of liturgical elements. Whenever people copied liturgical elements, they had a tendency of updating it. And therefore, for example, the Siddur of Amram Gaon is claimed to be the earliest Siddur, but we don't know what the earliest Siddur is, because almost everybody who copied it updated it. That is true of almost all Siddurim. In other words, people copy a Siddur to sell the manuscript. The people who buy the manuscript want to use it. Therefore, the manuscript of the Siddur is always being updated. So for Amram Gaon is claimed to be the first Siddur, but we're not sure what part of it is the earliest part. A similar thing happened to an early work of Notronai Gaon. When it comes to liturgical elements, it's not quite clear whether it's reflecting his reality, which is even before Seder of Amram Gaon, or is updated to the time when the scribe wrote it, hoping that the book would sell, and therefore to update its liturgical elements. The Kaddish first appears unambiguously in the Siddur Rav Saadia Gaon. That's already in the 900s. There it appears several times. It also appears in the place we want it to appear, as the bridge between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu. But it also appears in other places. So already by Rav Saadia Gaon, the multiple function of Kaddish has already taken place. Also, it has multiple forms, as we have. We have a Kaddish, we call Chatzi Kaddish, which is probably the original Kaddish. We have Kaddish Shalem or Kaddish Tidkabel. We have Kaddish de Rabbanan. We have Kaddish after Masechet. We have a special Kaddish at the burial. So the Kaddish has multiple roles and therefore is a multi-form prayer. Each edition allows it to perform another role. I cannot be at this time focused upon its multiple roles. It would take us too much of a field. I'm looking upon its original role in its terminology. So the argument goes that the Kaddish is formed based upon the Yishtabach. As evidence of that, let's look at the very opening line. The opening line is difficult to parse. It's not quite clear. It says Yitgadal v'Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah B'Alma Divra Chirutei. The question is, B'Alma Divra Chirutei. Does that expression go together or not? The Gaon Vilna already argued it does not. Meaning, what we're saying is Yitkadal v'Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah B'Alma. It is God's desire that his name become Gadol v'Kadosh in the world. Now I said God's desire. Where is the word desire? Kirutei. Kirutei in Aramaic is equivalent to kirtsono. Ayin and Sadik are two letters which get exchanged in Hebrew and Aramaic. Kirutei, kirtsono. So it is God's wish that his name become Gadol v'Kadosh b'Alma in the world. Now, where do we get this idea from? So if you look at the opening line of Yishtabach, it's quite amazing. In the opening line of Yishtabach, we have Yishtabach Shimcha, just like Shimcha, Yitkadav Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah. Now there, we have to translate the opening line the following way. Yishtabach Shimcha La'ad Malkeinu. Now watch it. The next four words modify Malkeinu. Who is Malkeinu? Malkeinu is Ha'el, HaMelech, HaGadol, VaKadosh. So therefore, Yishtabach Shimcha will take place where? Bashamayim Uva'aretz. So the same idea is expressed in Aramaic in the opening line. That is, God's name will be exalted or praised where? Bashamayim Uva'aretz. The Kaddish reduces the phrase Shamayim Va'aretz into one word, Bi'alma, in the world. But the point is, the praise of God takes place in the world. Who is God? Ha'el, HaMelech, HaGadol, VaKadosh. Since God is HaGadol, VaKadosh, if we're going to express that as a future praise, we say Yitkadal v'Yitkadash. Yitkadal v'Yitkadash is nothing more than taking the opening line of the Yishtabach, claiming that God is HaGadol, VaKadosh, and now that we're going to have a bridge, we're going back to the Baruch Hu, we say Yitgadal v'Yitkadash. Now the phrase Yitgadal v'Yitkadash is very strange because we call this prayer the Kaddish. Why would anybody call it the Kaddish if the opening words are Yitgadal v'Yitkadash? In fact, we say it so often, we don't even think about it. But if you're going to call it anything, you should call it by its opening word, Yitgadal. So if you look at Rav Saadia Gaon's Siddur, he refers to the Kaddish as Yitgadal. What's his opening word? Who ever heard of referring to a prayer by its second word? Not only by its second word, but if you go to line 6, it's not even repeated. So how did Yitkadash become prominent and Yitgadal, which is first in line, became secondary in importance? Okay, that's a phenomenon of the 11th and 12th century because of the significance of the Kaddish. for messianic or eschatological reasons, grew. So we'll go back to that when we finish the analysis. But just pay attention right now, since it's so common, we don't even pay attention. Why is it called the Kaddish? If anything, if you want to call it the second word, call it Yid Kadash. And Rab Saadia calls it Yid Gadal. Nonetheless, Kaddish took over, a form which we don't know from anywhere else, and replaced the Yid Gadal. So after Saadia Gaon, there's only one other commentator that I'm aware of, the Rokeach, who refers to Yid Gadal, which means by the 12th century, everybody's now calling it Kaddish. But in the time of Rab Saadia Gaon, they're calling it what? Yid Gadal, based on its opening word, which makes perfect sense. Okay, we'll get to that later, how to explain that transition. Okay, now going back to the Yishtabach. The Yishtabach opening line is equivalent to the opening line of the Kaddish. Then it says, Ki lacha no'eh. Now, this is key, is an explanation. Why should your name be praised on heaven and earth? Right? Ki lacha no'eh, it's appropriate to you. Then we have the word Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, which I mentioned before, is an introduction or anticipate its use in the Amidah, both in the first blessing and the seventh blessing, in the Avot prayer and the Modim. Then we have Shiru Shvacha Halev Zimra Ozem Shalah, and emphasize the poetry here. Shiru Shvacha Halev Zimra Ozem Shalah, all final rhymes. Then we have the word Netzach, because that's the way it appears in Vayavarech David, so we have to include the word. Then we go back to the rhyming scheme of the first word, Gedula, Gevurah, Tila, Betiferet. Then we have Kedusha U'Malchut. This is the key element. Kedusha U'Malchut. And the next line says, Brachot Vodot L'Shimcha Hagadol V'Kadosh. Why do we have the phrase L'Shimcha Hagadol V'Kadosh? Simply because it says Yid Gadal V'Yid Kadash. So Yid Gadal is Shimcha Gadol. Yid Kadash is Yishimcha HaKadosh. Shmei Rabbah. Therefore the name. So you can see how the Kaddish uses the language of the Yishtabach and emphasizes two things, Kedusha and Malchut. Where do we get Kedusha and Malchut together? So we have it together in the opening line. We have line 2, Vayamlich Malchutei, that's Malchut. And the other line says what? Yid Kadash. The choice of the language is also because in the upcoming first Brachav Shema, Mishabechim, Mefarim, Maritzim, Makdishim, Umamlichim. See the two together? Makdishim, Umamlichim. Now, according to the Kaddish, you should say Vayamlich Malchutei, but there it says Makdishim, Umamlichim, meaning Mamlichim, we say at Shem Ho'el HaMelech HaGadol HaGibor. We say that in crowning God Melech, and it ends with what? Kadosh Hu. So we call God Melech, and we end with the word Kadosh Hu. What are we doing? Mamlichim u'makdishim. By Mamlichim, I'm saying we call God Melech. By the word Makdishim, we call God Kadosh. And of course, we go on to say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So the use of the words is not an idea, it means the exact word. Vayamlich Malchutei, by saying what? Mamlichim. Just like Makdishim is what? Kadosh. So here, now we go down to line 3. Line 3 is extraordinarily difficult to explain, and I don't know anybody who has successfully explained it. What's b'chayechon of Yom Echon? Who is chayechon? Who is the chon here? Whose life is it? You could say b'chayenu, maybe ubiyomenu, even know what that means. Or you could refer to some them, maybe the people of Israel. But it's very strange in the second person. B'chayechon uv'chayechon Yom Echon. Right? And then these must be people living at the present time. Uv'chayei, the whole Beit Israel. And then the life of all the people of Israel, right? And then B'Galav Izman Kariv, something is going to happen real quickly. What's going to happen real quickly? Is that based on line 2, V'yatzmach Purkanei V'karei Mishichei? Or is it based on the opening 2 words, V'yamlich Malchutei? Because in parentheses of line 2, the Rambam has it, but other versions don't have it. So it'd be very difficult to say that line 3 plays on a part of line 2, in which many versions, the phrase Vayatzmach Purkanei Vikarei Mishichei is absent. On the other hand, we do have a document from about the 11th century, also found in the Gniza, of a ceremony for the making of the Gaonim. There were 3 or 4 offices, and there was a ceremony. And in that ceremony, they say the Kaddish, and since they're talking to the Av Beit Din and the Reish Mitzifta, and they're directing them, it says make perfect sense. B'chayechon uv'yomechon, meaning they were being addressed, and then when they talk about them, they then include everybody in the ceremony. Uv'chayei t'chol Beit Yisrael. So it could very well be that the phrase chayechon uv'yomechon come from the Gaonic ceremony, a thing which has been found in the Geniza, which begins with the Kaddish, mentions the names of the people, the Reish Mitzifta, the Reish Kala, and 2 others, in which they said, V'imru Amen. Okay, now I'm going to line 6. On line 6 is very strange. Why? Because I would have expected, if we're going to put all these verbs in the Hitpael form, Yitbarich, Yishtabach, Yitpaer, Yitramam, Yitnaseh, Yitada, Yitaleh, what happened to the opening 2 words? Why don't I repeat them? Why don't I say Kadal Kadash? They're totally missing. It's clear that line 6 is a take on line 5. Line 5 says Mevorach. So Yitbarach Yishtabach begins Yitbarach. The strange thing about it is, if God's name is already Mevorach, then why are you repeating Yitbarach? You've already said it. And where do the other ones come from? So I wouldn't be surprised if line 6, 7, and 8 was an independent unit. And it gets connected to line 5 because of Mevorach. Line 5 gets inserted after lines 1 through 4 because we're introducing the Borachu. So since the Kaddish comes after Yishtabach, it's going to borrow from the language of Yishtabach. Since the Kaddish becomes before the Borachu, right, then it will borrow language from there. So to make this clear to you, watch this now. Here we go. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mavorach Elam Omei Amaya is in Aramaic an introductory phrase to Baruch Hashem Mavorach Elam Voed. You see the word Baruch? You see a reference to God's name? And how does it in? Le'elam Voed. Now, the opening line there, Yehei Shmei Rabba Mavorach Le'elam Omei Amaya, is found in the Talmud. It was not created for this purpose. It was employed for this purpose. In other words, since the service Psuki de Zimra ends with Yishtabach, and Kriyat Shema V'Erchatecha begins with Baruch Hashem Mavorach Elam Voed, that is the communal response, not the words of the Chazan. Then the communal response, which got inserted into the Kaddish, anticipates the communal response, which is already part of Shaharit. Baruch Hashem Mavorach Elam Voed. Okay, now I'm going to go on more point with quite remarkable is here summarizes the common denominator. The Kaddish and the Yishtabach. The Kaddish has these 4 terms: Yitbarach, Yishtabach, Yipa'ar, Vitalel. The Yishtabach is the same in the exact same order. Brachot, Shvacha, Tiferet, Tila. The exact same 4 terms. Can't be by chance. The form in the Yishtabach is consistent. Brachot, Ushvacha, Tiferet, Utila. The form of the Yitpayel is consistent. Yitbarach, Yishtabach, Yitpa'ar, Yitalel. Yitbarach is Brachot. Yishtabach is Shvacha. Yitpa'er or Yitpa'ar is Tiferet. Yitalel is Tehila. The Kaddish has these 3 terms: Birchata, Shirata, Tushbachata. The Yishtabach has the same in the same order: Baruch, Birchata, Shir, Shirata, Tishbachot, Tushbachata. The Kaddish focuses on God's holiness and kingship through Yitkadash and Malchutei. The Yishtabach does by the comparable, Kedusha u'Malchut. Kedusha is equivalent to Yitkadash. Malchut is Malchutei. The Kaddish expresses eternity by saying Le'alam o Me'amaya. The Yishtabach has two ways. You can say Me'alam v'ad olam or Che'olamim. Same word, almost identical expression, one phrase in Aramaic, one phrase in classical Hebrew. Finally, line 6 beginning with Yisbarach and continue line 7 with says Leila min kol birchata shirata v'tushbachata. Where do these words come from and why are they inserted here? So I go back up. So you see it all? The blue. Leila min kol birchata shirata tushbachata v'nechamata. Why these four? Now we do have the idea in Vayavarech David that God exceeds all the praises said to him. Maramam akol bracha. God exceeds all the praises, which means we can praise God all we want, but we can never, our praises are never equivalent to the reality. God's grandeur exceeds all our praises. Fine, that's in Vayavarech David. Why did the Kaddish choose these four expressions? Birkata, Shirata, Tushbechata, Venechamata. Right? Why these four? So the answer, again, follows the same methodology. We're going to the bottom here. It says, Leilam in kol birchata, Shirata, Tushbecha, Venechamata. The methodology is you summarize what has taken place by encapsulating them in a short phrase, and you anticipate what's about to take place. So we just finished the Pesukei de Zimra, and we're now moving into Baruch Hu. What's our function? Summarize it. What's Birchata? The beginning of Pesukei de Zimra, which is Baruch She'amar. What is Shirata? That's the part after the Psalms of Pesukei de Zimra. What's the key element there? Az Yashir. Therefore, Shirata. What comes after Az Yashir? Yishtabach. Therefore, what do you say? Tushbechata. Now comes the most difficult one. What is Nechamata? So if you look at the commentaries, of which we have no shortage of on the Kaddish, there is no shortage of suggestions. What is Nechamata? The problem with all these suggestions is none of them are contextual. They play on the word Nechama. So for example, a very common one is when our misbehavior, as it were, forced God to destroy the temple, then we have to come around and menachem HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the loss of the temple and for the exile of the people. As if God says, I didn't want to do it, you made me love you. So what do? Nechamata. That's a very common explanation found in the Midrash, applied here. The trouble with it is, it takes Nechamata out of its context. It doesn't illuminate anything going on now. Rather, it's better to follow our methodology. Our methodology is we anticipate what's coming up, just like we epitomize what preceded. So what's Nechamata? So a recent book by Professor Bar Asher of the Hebrew Language Department at Hebrew University argues that Nechamata, that the Chet and the Ayin are Otiot mitchalfot, both Otiot groniot. So sometimes an Ayin will replace a Chet. Therefore, he argues that Nechamata is Ni'imot. Now, Ni'imot is a word for singing. Ni'imot yitenu. Ni'imot yitenu. Like Tishbachot, Ozmirot. Now, where does it come from? This he does not say. He argues that Nechamata means Ni'imot are songs. And therefore he stops by saying, Birkata, Shirata, Tishbachata, Ni'imot are all words for song. Why do we use the form Nechamata? Because it's the same form as the previous words, and the number of syllables matches Tushbechata, Nechemata. And since the sound plays a key role in the meaning. But if a word's Ni'imot appears twice in the Yosir Hamarot, Le'el Baruch Ni'imot Yitenu. Ni'imot means songs, and we also with the Kedusha, it's been Ni'ima. Kedusha, ben Ni'ima. Now, Ni'ima does not mean pleasantly, it means mellifluously. It is sung pleasantly. It's a way of singing. So it's not, as people translate, I mean, not mellifluously, but I mean melodiously. I'm sorry. People translate mellifluously, but it should be melodiously, meaning it is sung with the right tune, because we're portraying the singing of the angels, and the angels have a fixed tune for their praise of God, and they have to coordinate their tune. The symphony has to be a coordination act, and you can't have one group of angels precede another group of angels. They must come down on the same downbeat, which, by the way, is the interpretation of the phrase reshut. But maybe we'll get to that in a future presentation on Birchot Shema. So here, the first three words, Birchata, Shirata, Tushbachata, summarize what has taken place heretofore. Nechamata anticipates what's about to take place. Therefore, again, the Yishtabach, as the Kaddish, play this bridge role. And the bridge role always borrows from what preceded and anticipates what's about to come. Okay, so that explains the 4 words. Now, we're going back to the beginning, the Kaddish. How did it get its name? Especially when Rabbi Saadia Gaon already calls it Yud Gadol. Why did he change its name? So what happened was, it seems right after the First Crusade. Now, the First Crusade hit Germany very strongly. And the Second Crusade hit northern France, the city of Metz, very strongly. There were 3 communities on the Rhine. They're called, the communities called Shum, which spell out their names, Speyer, Magenza, Barmaiza. They were hit very strong by the Crusades. So what they did was they reinterpreted the phrase Shmei. So you know some versions will have Shmei, Shin, Mem, Yud, Hey. That could be the exact same thing as Shmei, and the Yud is just telling us to pronounce the Mem with a hard sound, A. The Yud means before it precedes a hard sound. There are 2 hard sounds, A and E. But in Beit Midrasho Shel Rashi, probably not Rashi himself, because Rashi died by 1104, the First Crusade is 1096, but in Beit Midrasho, which means his students, of which we have 3 major books, Sefer Ra, Sidur Rashi, and Sefer Pardes, emphasize Shmei is a composite of 2 words, Shin Mem plus Yud Hey. Therefore, Shmei does not mean his name or its name. It means the name of God. What's the problem? The name of God is truncated. There's only a Yud and a Hey. Where do we find the name of God truncated? With regard to Amalek. Case, right? And then we have the way God's name there is spelled Yud Hey, and God's throne is spelled without the Aleph. So the Midrash says, Kol zman shezar osha Amalek ba'olam, ein Hashem shalem, ve'ein kiso shalem. Means God's name is truncated, and God's throne is truncated. Means the reality and the authority of God are compromised. Avad zaro Amalek ba'olam, when Amalek is destroyed, then Hashem will be shalem. So instead of spelling it Yud Hey, we'll spell it Yud plus Hey plus Vav plus Hey. And instead of spelling it Kaf Samech, we'll add the Aleph, Alufo Shalom, to Kaf Samech, and you get what? Ki Say. So the line of the Kaddish became eschatological. What reinforced this was the interpretation that the verse behind the Kaddish is found in chapter 38:23 of Yechezkel, Hitgadilti Vitkadishti. And almost every commentator after the 12th century says it. The one major commentator who does not say this is Avram ben Rambam. And Avram ben Rambam lives in Egypt. They didn't experience the Crusades. There was no reason for the eschatolization of the Kaddish in Sephardic lands, at least in the 12th century and 11th century. So he does not say that. But everybody else attaches it to this verse. Because of this, there arose a problem starting with, it's thought to be starting with the Gaon Mivilna, but really sustained by the Mishnah Brura, that we should pronounce Yid Gadal V'Yid Kadash, Yid Gadel V'Yid Kadesh. And they argue because it's Hebrew. And where do they find the basis for this? In the Gaon Mivilna. Where does the Gaon Mivilna find the basis for this? In the books of Rashi. Sidur Rashi. The trouble with that is, if you look at Sidur Rashi, all Rashi says is that the two words are in Hebrew. He does not tell you how to pronounce it. Secondly, we're not sure in Sidur Hebrew how to pronounce Yud Kadal v'Yud Kadash in the Yud Payel. We say Titkadel v'Titkadesh b'toch Yerushalayim. Right? We can say Yud Kadal v'Yud Kadash. So the fact that it's in Hebrew does not tell us how to pronounce it. Secondly, the reason Rashi says it's in Hebrew is based upon the verse in Yechezkel, Hitgadilti v'Tkadishti. But there's no reason to go to the verse if the phrase Gadol v'Kadosh appears in the Yishtabach. In other words, in light of the function of the Kaddish, that it's the bridge between Yishtabach, Baruch Hu, and so on. And since the opening line of the Yishtabach mentions Hagadol v'Kadosh, we have adequate reason for saying Yid Gadal v'Yid Kadash. Moreover, it would explain the order of these two words. Why does Gadol come before the word Kadosh? Simply because we say Yid Gadal v'Yid Kadash, in the Yishtabach it comes beforehand. Normally, the expression is Hagadol v'Kadosh. We find it also in Birkat HaMazon. We find it elsewhere, about 4 or 5 different times. We find it in the Modim D'Rabanan. So the expression is Hagadol v'Kadosh. Therefore, what do we say? Yid Gadal v'Yid Kadash. There's no reason to believe that any part of the Kaddish is constructed to reflect a biblical verse. Clear, these words, Gadol v'Kadosh, are found all over the place, but there's no one verse that does it. Once they connected it to Yechezkel, then all of Yechezkel's eschatological hopes kicked in. So then it became a prayer for the coming of the Messiah. To reinforce that, we have Yatzmach Porkanei, V'Karei Mishichei. But originally, it was a bridge prayer. And the choice of Yid Gadal v'Yid Kadash is because Yishtabach mentions those two words. In fact, it's hard to see any single verse which is informing the construction of Yishtabach. Unlike, for example, the Amidah. In the Amidah, it's hard to find a line in the whole Amidah which is not based upon a biblical verse, even though it rarely, never cites a whole biblical verse. It quotes fragments of verses. And if you know the fragments of verse in the original biblical context, it will help you understand the Amidah. It's clear, therefore, the Amidah is a construction based upon the use of biblical verses. That is not true of the Kaddish. There's no line here that you need a biblical verse to crack its meaning. Therefore, there's no reason to believe that Gadol v'Kadash is based upon Yechezkel when there's such an available evidence as Gadol v'Kadosh from the Yishtabach. Okay, so in summary, the Kaddish is a bridge prayer. Now, as a bridge prayer, it concludes every part of the service. So ultimately, it came to conclude the service. So now you start up as a conclusion of Psukei de Zimra, and ends up as a conclusion of every service. Once it became a conclusion of every service, then we have to add lines 11 and 12, because the Talmud adds that Tefillah should end with Shalom, because Birkat Konim ends with Shalom. Sim Shalom is the last prayer. Hashkivenu ends with Shalom. So this idea that prayer should end with Shalom, and since it became the concluding prayer, they appended to it the conclusion of the Amidah. Oseh Shalom B'Mramav. Now there we take 3 steps backwards. In the Kaddish, we do not take 3 steps forward. But since people are used to taking 3 steps backward, Oseh Shalom B'Mramav, people started taking 3 steps forward when they say the Kaddish, meaning the liturgical use of the Kaddish started mimicking the liturgical use of the Amidah. Now we have a problem. The problem is, how do you go from the Kaddish to Oseh Shalom? In the Amidah, you don't have that problem. You know why? Because the Amidah ends with Sim Shalom or Shalom Rav. So therefore, you're on the theme of Shalom. You continue. Oseh Shalom B'Mramav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, V'Kol Yisrael V'Yimru Amen. The trouble is the Kaddish doesn't. So my theory is the line 9 is added to abridge the end of Kaddish with line 11. How does it perform that function? Well, first, by being Aramaic, it sounds like it's an extension of the Kaddish. By having the word Yehi Shlama Rabba min Shamaya, it sounds like Oseh Shalom Bimramov. So it's a perfect line because it incorporates elements of the preceding element, the Kaddish in Aramaic. Secondly, it introduces the beginning line of line 11, Oseh Shalom. And unless you miss it, I'm going to repeat 4 words which are identical. Aleinu v'Kol Yisrael. Line 9 and line 11. Aleinu v'Kol Yisrael. Therefore, when you say line 11, I imagine in the popular imagination, in fact, it was in my imagination for many years, I just thought I was saying in Hebrew what I said in Aramaic, especially since I didn't understand the Aramaic, I understood the Hebrew, then the Hebrew began to dominate. So what I'm suggesting is that line 9, V'yamru Amen, is a transitional line between the end of the Kaddish and the Oseh Shalom. The Oseh Shalom was added when the Kaddish became the conclusion of the service, and therefore we conclude the service just like we conclude the Amidah on the theme of Shalom. Okay, that covers our treatment of Kaddish, its function and its origins. We did not talk about Kaddish Yatom, nor will I talk about that. That deserves a whole presentation on its own. It's not simple, it's a complex phenomenon, and took generations for it to come into being what it is now. But the original function of the Kaddish, I think I've made clear to you, and almost every word becomes accordingly clear. And you see in the Kaddish, there's hardly an extra word in the whole Kaddish, and even the phrase, Leila min kol birchata, shirata, tishbechata, v'nechamata, are not just words there. Every single word refers to some part of the prayer. Now, you know this idea from the Magen Avot on Friday night, where we summarize, as it were, the Amidah by 1 or 2 words expression. The one who made this methodology famous is Yehuda Bar Yakar. Yehuda Bar Yakar was a teacher of the Ramban. He wrote, in my opinion, the best Perush ever written to the Siddur, word for word. Nobody says more in fewer words than he does. I would highly recommend that people get a hold of it. It's a 2-volume work. It's called Perush HaTfilot VaBrachot, Rabbeinu Yehuda Bar Yakar. My opinion, the single best commentary to the Siddur ever written, word for word. Now, the Rokeach says a lot more, and many others do, but nobody says as much in so few words. He's the one, in the introduction, develops this methodology of how frequently we have prayers which use 1 or 2 words to summarize a prayer which just been said. That's why in a vote, Magen Avot, you say Me'ein habrachot. Me'ein means Me'ein, just like Me'ein Shmon Esrei, which is an abbreviated form of the Havinenu, meaning you use a word or an expression to summarize a whole prayer. That same methodology is used with Birchata, Shirata, Tishbachata, V'nechamata. Each word summarizes the prayer. The methodology is used elsewhere, and all we're doing is applying it here. Okay, we're now open for questions, comments, and reflections about the Kaddish, its meaning, and its function in light of its origin.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Kimelman. Please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I will read some of the questions that were already put in the chat. It's been mentioned in the chat that we might have fewer questions than usual because you answered several of the questions people had coming in with your presentation. Mitch asks, you note the late reference of the Kaddish in Masechet Sofrim. I was always taught that the Kaddish, at least in some form, was composed by Anshe Knesset Gedola. One suggested proof is that the opening words are drawn from Yechezkel Yikadalti V'Tadishti. What is your understanding, and do you believe the Anshe Knesset Gedola had a role in the Kaddish's earliest composition?
No. The Anshe Knesset Gedola, first, we don't know who was a member of it. It could have been Zechariah, Chaga, Malachi. It could be Shimon HaTzadik, who's Mishayareh or Mireisheh, depending upon your version. Many prayers which of unknown origin are attributed to them. The problem with that theory is we don't have the Kaddish appearing in Talmudic literature. We have the phrase Davar Shebekidusha refers to the Kedusha, it never refers to the Kaddish. So why, if Kaddish is from Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, does it not appear in Talmudic literature? Why the first place it appears unambiguously is Hizur Rab Sajagon. Secondly, that wouldn't explain its bridge version. And once we've broken its connection with that pasuk in Yecheskel, I see no reason to attribute it to Anshe Knesset HaGedolah.
Okay, so as a follow-up to that,
Nor as far as any classical commentary do that. Yeah.
interesting. Mitch asks, which kind of follows on that, if Kaddish is now seeming to be a post-Talmudic prayer, why then does it require a minyan being treated as a Davar Shebikdusha?
The phrase Davar B'Kedusha is a very difficult expression. It's expanded and expanded. So people now apply it to Baruch Hu. You can't have a Davar B'Kedusha unless the word Kadosh appears there. A Davar Shebekidusha. Rabbinic terminology is extraordinarily precise. And if it says Davar B'Kedusha, it means the word Kadosh appears. But the Kaddish, Davar Kedusha, which appears in Masechet Megillah, they don't mention the Kaddish because it wasn't around. A better explanation is that when you have a responsive prayer, you need a minyan to respond to. So just like the Baruch Hu requires a minyan, not because it's Davar Shebekidusha, because of the response. The Kedusha is a Davar Shebekidusha and has a response. The Kaddish has a response. Yehei Shmei Rabbah. So insofar as it's a communal prayer, which one individual says and people respond, we need a minimal number of people for response. What is that? That is the minyan. So rather than saying Davar Kedusha requires a minyan, it would be, in my opinion, more precise to say those prayers which require a communal response require a community.
All right, fair enough. A question of mine. I'd heard in the past the idea that Kaddish originated within the Beit Midrash, and particularly, I guess, along the lines of Kaddish D'Rabbanan. Am I making that up? Were there speculations in that? And do you, I guess, disagree with that?
Yes, on both counts. The Yosef Heinemann, probably one of the most quoted commentators on the liturgy among academics in the 20th century, did what is called form analysis, or critical form analysis. And he decided, based upon certain forms, some prayers originated in Beit Midrash and others not. And in his book on Tefillah, he has a whole chapter on this. I have to admit to you that I have not been convinced. In other words, I do not think that a single setting like a Beit Midrash or all Beit Midrash were the same, that we can explain prayers by their origin. I much prefer a literary analysis, an historical analysis, and see how it fits into the Siddur. Now, one of the arguments that Heinemann likes, and he applies it also to the Aleinu, is he argues, how can you have an eschatological prayer which does not pray for the rebuilding of Yerushalayim? He said, that's impossible. Therefore, it must have been created before Yerushalayim was destroyed. Therefore, it must be what? A second temple prayer. That argument he applies to the Kaddish, and he applies to the Aleinu. Neither one, both are eschatological according to him. Neither one look forward to the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. You can't have a redemptive prayer in Judaism which does not look for the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. Therefore, it must have been composed before Yerushalayim was destroyed. The prayer does not hold, the argument does not hold water. Number one, we have second temple prayers which talk about the building of Yerushalayim. The word boneh can mean rebuild, but the word boneh can also maintain the building of. So even the second temple, people prayed for the maintenance of Yerushalayim. And the same word which came to mean rebuild was originally mean maintain the building of, because don't forget, Jerusalem had already been destroyed. Now, its application to Aleinu is strange because Aleinu has nothing Jewish about it except the universalization of God's worship. Yerushalayim is not mentioned, Mashiach is not mentioned, mitzvot are not mentioned, Shabbat is not mentioned, the Mikdash itself is not mentioned. In other words, Aleinu and its companion prayer, Kaddish, talk about the universalization of God's worship, where God is declared king. Therefore, Aleinu says, L'takein olam v'malchut shaddai, v'yichablu kulam et ol malchutecha, which means all of humanity will do kabbalat ol malchut shemayim, as Israel does when it says the Shema. So it is totally eschatological. It is not Jewish-centered. The goal of Judaism, according to these two prayers, is the universalization of the worship of the one God, where all humanity will makablim alehem ol malchut shemayim.
Right, excellent. I got it's quite a bit of bonus material in the response to that question, and I thank you. I think I've addressed all the questions in the chat that weren't really addressed during Rabbi.
I want to ask something. The Imru Amen, we never got an answer to that.
No, the words
Does
Imru
Amen have to do with that 10 people? Is that what you're saying?
There are two things. If it says Imru Amen, that because you don't know you're supposed to say Amen. When I say a bracha, you say Amotzi lechem min haaretz. If I hear you, I say Amen. In fact, according to halacha, there's no Amen Yatoma. If I don't hear the bracha, I'm not supposed to say Amen. So Imru Amen, and then what do you say Imru Amen? At the end. So there's good evidence that it's a composite prayer. The first part ended, you said what? Imru Amen. The part two ended, you say Imru Amen. The last two lines are two separate lines. So every time you added something, what did you say again? Imru Amen. That's the best evidence that the Kaddish was not composed at one time. It's a composite prayer put together in light of its function. And when we finish each roll, what do we say? Imru Amen. To which I say, Amen.
Okay, well, many thanks to Rabbi Professor Kimelman for enlightening us this evening and 2 weeks ago. We thank everyone to join us. We will send out a link to the video of this program in case you missed anything or would like to review, as I know I would like to, or would like to share the video with others. That link will include the source sheet as well on our website. We also hope to provide everyone with the opportunity to purchase Rabbi Kimelman's forthcoming book at a pre-publication price. Please stay tuned to your email for details. Thank you to our sponsors whom we named at the beginning of the webinar, and we will also share, I just shared into the chat. If you haven't already, please join our email list by filling out the form on utj.org. You'll find that form under Contact Us, and please also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We would also appreciate your feedback on this webinar. I put the link into the chat, and we'll also include that when we email out the video. Thanks again to everyone for joining us and to Rabbi Kimelman for a really wonderfully enlightening 2 sessions.